You should have seen me at dinner tonight when I was going. In tempo. Yeah. He never swallowed any of it, man. It was all right here.
They say legends never die, but some legends get buried on purpose. And if you've ever wondered what Elvis Presley was really like behind the glitter, the cameras, and the carefully manufactured image, then listen closely. Because what surfaced decades after his death wasn't just rare footage. It was the one moment Elvis was caught completely unprotected. A moment the people around him prayed the world would never see.
This story doesn't begin with nostalgia. It doesn't start with a happy memory, a hit song, or a screaming crowd. It starts with a reel, an old, dust-covered fragment of film that should have been destroyed long before it ever had a chance to be found. A fragment that captured Elvis Presley in a way the world was never supposed to witness. Frustrated, exhausted, angry, and telling the truth. Not the polished truth. Not the interview truth. Not the Hollywood scripted truth. But the raw, unfiltered truth of a man trapped inside a legend he could no longer control. To understand why this footage is so explosive, you have to understand the cage Elvis lived in during the final stretch of the 1960s. He was a superstar, yes, but a superstar surrounded by businessmen, handlers, and executives who had shaped his image for so long that he barely recognized the person he was supposed to be. Every move was calculated, every appearance was choreographed, every word was filtered before it left his mouth. But behind closed doors, Elvis was changing. The world was changing, and the pressure was building. This footage was recorded during a period when Elvis was desperate to reclaim his identity. He was tired of bad movie scripts, tired of lifeless studio sessions, tired of being told what he could sing, what he couldn't sing, where he could stand, and who he could trust. He felt the walls closing in, and the people around him felt it too. Those closest to Elvis called this era the spark before the fire, the moment when Elvis started pushing back. The footage was captured inside a rehearsal room, a place that should have been safe for him, a place where he was supposed to experiment, relax, joke around, and rediscover the music that made him famous in the first place. But that day, Elvis wasn't relaxed. He wasn't joking. And the last thing he wanted was a camera running. According to the few insiders who dared to talk about it, something had been simmering in Elvis for months. A quiet frustration that was turning into open rebellion. He was tired of the machine built around him, tired of being treated like a product instead of a human being, tired of grinding himself into the ground for people who only saw dollar signs. So when he walked into that rehearsal room and realized the camera crew was already set up, something inside him snapped. This wasn't one of the cheerful behind-the-scenes clips fans are used to. This wasn't Elvis laughing, strumming a guitar, wearing his famous grin. This was Elvis tired, Elvis irritated, Elvis daring to express the things he'd kept bottled up for years. And here's what made this footage dangerous. For the first time, Elvis wasn't performing. He wasn't smoothing over the truth to keep the peace. He wasn't hiding his resentment behind jokes. He wasn't pretending everything was fine. He was openly questioning the people running his career. He was openly calling out the way he was being pushed, pulled, and manipulated. He was openly acknowledging how lost he felt inside the Elvis Presley brand, and the camera caught all of it. That's why this reel became a threat. Not because it showed Elvis being unprofessional, not because it showed him being emotional, but because it showed him being honest, an honesty that could expose reputations, challenge power structures, and unravel the myth that others had spent years and millions building around him. The people in the room froze. You can practically feel it as witnesses later described it. Elvis wasn't directing his anger at one person. He was speaking into the air, speaking to the walls, the ceiling, the whole machine, all while the camera kept rolling. And then just as he stopped talking, something happened. Something subtle, something only Elvis understood. He realized the camera was still on, and in that instant, everything changed. His face, his posture, the atmosphere around him. Because Elvis knew exactly what had been captured, he knew how dangerous it was, and he knew that if the wrong person saw it, it wouldn't just be a problem. It would be a war. That was the beginning of the cover-up. That was the moment the footage became forbidden, and that was only the beginning of what this film truly revealed. The moment Elvis walked into that rehearsal room, the energy shifted. People who had worked with him for years swore they had never felt the room so tense, so fragile, so electrically uncertain, because this wasn't the charming Elvis who joked with the boys and flashed that famous grin. This was a man carrying something heavy, and for the first time, he wasn't trying to hide it. He dropped his coat onto a chair, didn't even look up, didn't greet anyone, didn't ask about lighting, sound, or arrangements. He went straight to the microphone, placed his hand on it, and took a long, exhausted breath that told everyone he wasn't in the mood for small talk. Insiders later described the atmosphere as waiting for a storm to crack open. And they were right. Elvis had been simmering for weeks, maybe months. The burden of playing a character instead of a human being was finally clawing its way out of him. And this rehearsal, this private, supposedly safe space, was the first time that pressure found an escape route. The band watched him carefully. Some pretended to tune their instruments, but everyone was really watching his face. There was no sparkle in his eyes, no playfulness, no warmth. He looked like a man who had been pushed 1 inch too far for 1 day too long. He cleared his throat, tried to start a song, stopped halfway through the first line. Then he said it. Words no one expected. Words no one had ever heard from his mouth before. Words that would later make the footage so dangerous that people in power would fight to bury it. He said, quietly but firmly, "I don't even recognize myself anymore." The room froze, because Elvis Presley, the most famous man in America, the king, the icon, was admitting he felt lost. Not creatively lost, not emotionally lost, personally lost. He kept talking, almost as if he forgot other people were standing there. He said he was tired of being surrounded by people who smiled at him while they tightened the leash. He said he felt like every decision had already been made for him before he even opened his mouth. He said he wanted his music back, his sound, his voice, his direction. But every time he tried to fight for it, someone shut him down. And then he said the part that would have gotten careers destroyed if the footage ever went public. "It feels like everyone's making money off Elvis Presley except me." That sentence alone created a shockwave, because everyone in that room knew who he meant without him having to say a name. The emotional flood kept coming. Elvis talked about sleepless nights, about waking up feeling empty, about being isolated in his own fame. He talked about how fast the world was moving and how slow his soul felt trying to keep up. He talked about fans seeing a superhero while he felt like a ghost in his own life. He talked about fear, real fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of burning out, fear of losing the people he loved, fear of dying young, even though he hadn't yet lived the life he wanted. Some people tried to interrupt him, tried to calm him, tried to pull him back into familiar territory. But Elvis wasn't stopping. Not today. Not after everything he had swallowed down for years. Then he shifted into something even more personal. He began confronting the contracts, the obligations, the endless cycle of performances and deals he never fully understood. He questioned why he was tied to promises made years ago. He questioned why his name was being used to feed a machine he no longer felt safe inside. For the people listening, this was the first time they saw Elvis without the armor. No charm, no humor, no mask. Just a man who reached his breaking point. A man who finally allowed himself to say what he'd been choking on quietly for far too long. And just when it felt like he had said everything he needed to say. Just when the air in that room couldn't get any thicker. Just when everyone thought the moment was over. Elvis revealed something more. He admitted that he had been thinking about walking away, not for a break, Not for a vacation, not for a pause, but for good. And that's when the panic truly began. Because if Elvis meant what he said, the empire built on his back would collapse overnight. But Elvis wasn't finished. He took a step back from the microphone, his voice lower now, heavier, almost trembling with truth. Then he said the sentence the camera wasn't supposed to catch. "I just want out, before this thing kills me." That line alone turned the footage from uncomfortable to explosive, from emotional to dangerous, from private to forbidden. Because the moment Elvis said those words, the people in charge realized this footage wasn't just damaging. It was lethal, and they were willing to do anything to keep it buried. The moment Elvis walked out of that rehearsal room, everything snapped. The silence he left behind wasn't calm. It was shock. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone understood exactly what had just happened and exactly how dangerous it was. Because Elvis hadn't just vented. He hadn't just opened up. He had said things that could expose the very people who controlled him. And worst of all, the camera had recorded every second. The first person to break the silence wasn't a musician or an assistant or even a friend. It was one of Colonel Parker's men, one of those quiet, sharp-eyed watchers who never smiled and never missed a detail. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply said, "Turn that off and give me the tape." That's when the panic began. Everyone in the room suddenly understood the stakes. This wasn't just sensitive material. This wasn't just a bad day in the studio. This was the kind of footage that could unravel decades of control, reputation, and financial power. The Colonel's entire empire relied on Elvis being compliant, cheerful, and predictable. What Elvis had said in that room shattered all three. Within minutes, Colonel Parker himself was notified, and what happened next would become one of the most whispered-about cover-ups in Elvis lore. The Colonel didn't come down to the rehearsal room. He didn't want to be seen panicking. He operated from the shadows, issuing orders like a general preparing for war. The message was simple. Find that footage, lock it away, and make sure the boy never sees it. From that point on, everyone involved was pulled into the operation. The cameraman was interrogated, the sound engineer was pressured. Assistants were told to retrace every inch of tape movement. Studio staff were ordered to deny the recording existed. One assistant, who spoke about it years later, said it felt like they were cleaning up a crime scene without a body. No one dared ask questions. Not about the footage. Not about Elvis's outburst. Not about what would happen if this reel leaked. Because they all knew the truth. If Elvis ever saw the footage, if he ever realized how raw and honest he had been, he might actually walk away. And the Colonel couldn't let that happen. So the hunt began. At first, they believed they had it under control. The tape seemed accounted for. One reel, clearly marked, placed inside a locked metal case. But panic made people sloppy, and sloppy people make mistakes. Within hours, someone realized there wasn't one tape. There were two. The camera operator had run a backup reel, a common habit in case the main tape jammed. That second reel had vanished. That's when the cover-up turned aggressive. Phones were called, offices were searched, people were threatened with losing their jobs. Some were told they would never work in the industry again if even a whisper of that footage surfaced. But the more they dug, the more terrified they became. Because the missing reel wasn't missing by accident. Someone had already taken it. Someone who thought Elvis deserved better. Someone who believed the truth shouldn't be hidden. It triggered a paranoid scramble inside the Colonel's circle. Staff checked trash bins, cars, equipment cases, even jackets and pockets. Every person who had entered or left the building that day was questioned. By midnight, they thought they'd found it. An unmarked reel in a storage room, tucked between two unrelated cases. But when they played it back, they realized it wasn't the missing tape at all. It was another rehearsal from weeks earlier. The missing reel was still out there. That night, the colonel ordered every floor of the studio searched again. He demanded the security logs. He made calls to RCA executives. He even instructed someone to draft a legal statement just in case they needed to threaten anyone directly. Why so much fear over one tape? Because the footage didn't just capture Elvis complaining, it captured Elvis revealing things that could destroy careers. It captured him questioning the colonel's control. It captured him acknowledging the exploitation he'd been living under. It captured him saying he wanted out. For Colonel Parker, that footage wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. And then, just when it seemed the entire reel had vanished into thin air, one of the assistants quietly mentioned something that changed the entire operation. What if the tape didn't disappear, but was saved? That single question left the room cold. Because if someone saved that footage, if someone deliberately protected it, it meant the truth was never fully buried. It meant the cover-up had failed, and it meant that someday, maybe decades later, the world would finally see the Elvis they tried so hard to silence. And that's exactly what happened next. For years, the missing reel became a ghost story whispered behind studio doors. Some said it had been destroyed. Others believed the colonel found it and locked it away forever. But the truth was far more powerful and far more poetic, because the reel didn't vanish. It survived. It waited. And when it finally resurfaced decades later, it didn't just reveal a moment, it revealed a man the world never truly knew. The recovered footage begins quietly. No music, no backup vocals, just Elvis sitting alone, guitar resting on his knee. His shoulders are heavy, his breathing slow, his eyes distant. You can tell he's exhausted, not physically, but spiritually. This isn't the king in a jumpsuit. This isn't the heartthrob or the movie star. This is Elvis Presley, a man who had run out of places to hide. He strums a chord, lets it ring, then another, and then he speaks. Not to the room, not to the camera, not to the band, but to himself. He says, "If I could start all over, I'd do it different. I'd sing what I want. I'd live how I want. I'd make music for me, not for anyone else." There's no anger in his voice now. The fury from earlier in the day has melted into something deeper, something more painful. This is the part of the footage that hits the hardest, not because it's shocking, but because it's honest. A kind of honesty Elvis rarely allowed the world to witness. He admits he feels trapped, but not in a dramatic, explosive way. It's quieter, more heartbreaking, like he's confessing something he's never said out loud. He talks about the weight of fame, how it never felt like a blessing, how it slowly took pieces of him he never got back, how the people he trusted the most often controlled him the tightest. Then he says something no fan, no executive, no family member was ever supposed to hear. "Sometimes I feel like everybody owns a piece of me, except me." For a moment, he goes silent. And that silence says more than the words ever could. The next part of the footage is what made this reel so dangerous. Elvis begins naming the pressures, contracts that boxed him in, schedules that drained him, deals he never agreed to but lived under anyway. He doesn't mention the colonel by name, but he doesn't have to. Every sentence is a shadow pointed in that direction. He talks about the endless cycle of touring, filming, performing, promoting, how the world saw the glamour, but none of the damage it caused. He admits he's scared of the pace he's keeping, scared of the toll it's taking on his body, scared of what will happen if something doesn't change. Then his voice drops again. "I don't want to die tired." That line stays with you long after you hear it. Because when you know how the story ends, it becomes impossible not to feel the weight of those words. Elvis wasn't just admitting exhaustion. He was predicting something he felt coming long before anyone else did. As the footage continues, he speaks more openly about wanting freedom, not retirement, not a break. Freedom, creative freedom, personal freedom, emotional freedom. A life where he wasn't just Elvis Presley the icon, but Elvis Presley the human being. And then comes the final devastating confession. If I keep going like this, I won't last. There's no dramatics, no trembling voice, no desperate plea, just truth. Quiet, heavy, undeniable truth. That single moment explains everything, why the footage was buried, why the colonel panicked, why everyone in that room froze the moment they realized the camera was still running. Because Elvis hadn't just criticized the system, he had exposed it. This footage didn't threaten Elvis's image. It threatened theirs. The tape ends the same way it began, with Elvis alone. He sets the guitar down, he rubs his face, tired. He whispers something barely audible. I just want my life back. That's the final frame. That's the moment frozen in time. That's the truth they tried to keep the world from hearing. When the footage finally resurfaced, quietly, privately, years later, it didn't shock people because Elvis looked angry. It shocked them because Elvis looked real vulnerable, cornered, human. It proved what so many suspected but never heard from his own mouth. Elvis Presley wasn't destroyed by fame. He was destroyed by the people who controlled it. And this forbidden fragment of truth was the only time he ever said it out loud. If this story showed you a side of Elvis you never knew, make sure to subscribe. I release deep dive documentaries uncovering the hidden truths behind the world's greatest legends. Comment below and tell me which secret, mystery, or lost moment you want me to reveal next.